So we're joined today by John David Ebert, a cultural critic and philosopher and mythologist, and we're going to be speaking about his latest book, The New Media Invasion, The Rise of Digital Technologies and the World They Are Unmaking. John, maybe to start off, we can begin with the image on the cover of the book. Can you explain that and why you chose that image, a very old one, to talk about new media?
Yes. What I had in mind there was a couple of things. Number one, the character of St. Jerome is the patron saint of libraries, archives, and so forth. So he's like the old guardian of the media order. And I thought it would be a good idea to sort of invoke him at the start of a book in which traditionally gods of media are invoked in traditional texts. Like, for example, the Greeks always invoke the muses, right? Muse is part of the oral tradition. Sing in me, muse, is the invocation. That's from the oral tradition and carries over into the written tradition, so that the poets are still writing that, even though by the time you get to them, they're writing these things out rather than just singing orally. And in India, anytime you would start a text, you would invoke the god of pathways there, Ganesha. He would have to be invoked. Ganesha clears pathways through forests. So he clears a path for you in advance, so you invoke him at the start of any undertaking. And I wanted to do something like that for the start of this book. And I chose, so I chose him, and I chose this particular image because what's interesting about it is that he looks like he's perplexed by something in this image, and it's sort of a mirror of what's perplexing me about the problem with all the new media and the threat that all the new media are posing to the old Gutenbergian media. This is definitely a Gutenbergian image rather than a new media image, but I definitely wanted a sense to communicate to the reader an image there with a semiotic that communicated that you're going to be looking at the relationship of these very old traditions, archaic forms of media, to the new traditions. So I think that's what the image communicates.
So speaking of this old and new, in your book you're describing that the internet is not like, let's say, the printing press, as many contemporary enthusiasts say. It is in contrast. Can you maybe go into that, about the differences between this old and new media revolution?
Yes. More often than not, you hear media theoreticians comparing the effects of the new media, especially, specifically the internet, which is the giant in all of this, the sort of colossal new medium that corresponds in terms of its effects with the printing press, which was also a colossal new medium in the 15th century and in the 16th century when it came about. And indeed, it is the case that the printing press reshaped and resculpted, as any reader of McLuhan knows, the entire media landscape in the shift from the medieval to the Renaissance period. The shift from medieval to Renaissance is about equivalent to the shift from an oral, acoustic, highly tactile culture to a culture that favors visuality, linearity, and visually connected linear space expressed in depth perspective and painting. This is all a kind of space that's unified by the eye, and particularly the eye that scans lines linearly along a printed page moving from left to right. So the eye then, with the printing press, is the new tool. And this is an ocular culture. This is the culture, recall that it just recently with the scholastics invented lenses and optics and eyeglasses. And we had already laid the groundwork by that point, by the 15th century, where the scholastics had laid the groundwork for a very precise analytical kind of consciousness, the scholastic consciousness, that was already cutting up nature, dicing it up and analyzing it, putting it to the rack and torturing its seeds from it. So all that laid the groundwork for the coming of the printing press, which was an ocular medium, very analytical, very linear, and very consistent with the world from out of which it came. Now, when we contrast this with the internet, the reason why I don't think it's a good analogy to say that the internet is doing to our society what the printing press did to the medieval society, and that we shouldn't be too anxious about it, because really it's just a matter of recalibrating our sensory ratios and allowing it to settle in. The problem is the internet is having a catastrophic effect on our society. The printing press exerted its revolution over a period of about 2 centuries. It took about 2 centuries for the medieval illuminated manuscript to be wiped out and displaced and replaced by the new printed book with all its indexes and Arabic numerals and table of contents and its new method of citation and all of that. It took a couple of centuries for that to really settle in, and it gave time, a lot of time for people to adjust. and they tended to adjust by and large rather smoothly. In the case of the internet, what we're looking at is it's not a revolution. It's not revolutionary or evolutionary. It's catastrophic, because the changes that the internet is exerting is happening in the space of about, since 1995. So we're looking at about 15, 20 years that all of a sudden these transformations are taking place where all these media are disappearing, newspapers are folding up and going online, bookstores are closing down, we've lost record stores. All of these traditional media are disappearing, and they're disappearing very fast, so fast that we don't really have time to adjust to this situation. So what we're looking at, the analogy might be to the advent of the printing press as a kind of Cambrian explosion of media animal forms, whereas what we're looking at now with the internet is an extinction event, a sort of Permo-Triassic extinction event in which 95% of all the species are being wiped out, and what's being left is a single species, namely the internet.
I guess to lead in, the next question, perfect. So in your book, you speak about that media is the study of death and resurrection. So is this what we're looking at here? Is this like a common theme in cultural evolution where there's a Cambrian explosion of invention and technology followed by a mass extinction?
Yes, it's the internet apart. If we go back and we look at the evolution of media as Marshall McLuhan did, and McLuhan was the master of this. There's nobody who even comes close to him for his penetrating insight in the evolution, in the death and resurrection of media forms. Like, for example, he says that every new medium that comes along actually creates a new container or vessel, the content of which is an older medium. So, for example, when you get television coming along, the content of television is the movie, right? When movies came along, the content of the movie was the novel, right? When the printing press came along, the content of the manuscripts that were being printed were the old medieval illuminated manuscripts. So each new medium that comes along that sort of sounds the death knell for the medium before it also retrieves that older medium and brings it back in a transformed form. It becomes the content of a new space. And likewise with today's situation, where we can say that something like the new medium of YouTube, for example, the content of YouTube is all of electronic media. Whether we're talking about music videos, old television shows, commercials, all of that is now the content of the new medium of YouTube.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that. You can basically get any kind of movie on there. Even new movies that come out, they're up there at least for a couple of days before YouTube takes them down. So it's almost as if like everything's instant history or something like that. But we'll get into that, I guess, in the other question. So in your book, you describe two different kinds of light on and light through. How is the personal computer similar to the illuminated manuscript of medieval Europe? And what kind of world is this self-luminous technology like the iPad or the laptop, the computer, creating?
Well, the distinction between light on and light through is McLuhan's distinction, right? So it's a distinction that he made where he said the entire medieval edifice, the cultural apparatus of the medieval world is based on light through. You just think of stained glass and you get the image immediately, but the connotations of it are that the light of the spirit is shining through everything that was done, every art form that was done. Everything is always trying to render some temporal, accidental, ephemeral phenomenon transparent to the transcendent imagery of the biblical world. So we're always trying to see in medieval art and culture temporary, transitory phenomena becoming diaphanous, really, to biblical phenomena. So it's about light through. But by the time you get to the printing press, it shifts to light on. That is to say, we no longer have the illuminated manuscript, which, like stained glass with light coming through. Now we have the illuminated manuscript, where light has to be shined down upon it so that the eye can read it. And then the oral tradition, the oral and tactile and acoustic world of the medieval edifice shifts over to the visual world, and the eye requires light in order to see. So the phenomena are no longer self-luminous. Now, what I was doing in this book is analogizing the new media, especially video screens and monitors with laptops particularly in mind, and personal computers, but also handheld gadgets and devices. They retrieve the phenomenon of stained glass. They're sort of equivalent to electronic stained glass, to borrow a term from William Thompson, in which it struck me one day looking at an iPad. It looks very much like it's so luminous and beautiful to look at, and the resolution is so clear. It does look very much like a piece of stained glass. So it's a self-luminous form of technology, just as stained glass was, just as the illuminated manuscript was. And I analogize this to a tradition in Indian philosophy where a distinction is made between sthula forms and sukshma forms. Sukshma forms are self-luminous forms, and they are the forms of dream and myth. These are the forms of the soul. When you go to sleep at night and dream, you are inside of a sort of movie theater where all the forms are self-luminous. They radiate their own internal energies, like the bioluminescent fish at the bottom of the ocean. They radiate their own light. And so the forms of dream and myth and the architecture of the subtle body does this. It's self-luminous. And people, when they die, when they have near-death experiences and they come back and talk about them, they always talk about, the afterlife is this giant world of light. Everything is made out of these beings of light. So that whole world of myth and dream seems to connect to the astral plane. It's a world of self-luminous forms. It does not require light on. But sthula forms are the forms of the physical world, the forms of gross matter, and they require external light. The sun has to shine down upon them in order for us to see them. So these are the forms of waking consciousness. They change form very slowly. They're subject to the mechanical law of causality. A causes B, which causes C, and you get the billiard ball effect. And so everything unfolds in accordance with the laws of Newtonian space and time, traditional laws of causality. So those are the two different kinds of matter, sukshma and sthula, and so I call the new technologies sukshma technologies because they're self-luminous like mythic forms.
And is this self-luminous technology, is it, how to say it, is it bringing back this sort of mythical dreamlike consciousness? Do you think it's going to impact human societies in that way, or is it creating a kind of false dream in which we're all in kind of like a virtual reality, like the Matrix?
I would say yes to both questions, conditionally, which is to say that the video world, the world of electronic screens and self-luminous technology has created a kind of parallel reality, a parallel dimension, a dimension that retrieves the phenomena which in ancient societies and tribal societies, where the magical consciousness structure is the main operative structure of consciousness there, and in which forms and phenomena are experienced in ghostly terms. The cult of the ancestors. There's a sense in tribal societies that the dead are always hovering around us. The dead never leave these societies. They're always hovering around. And so you always get this sense of ghosts and phantoms and so forth. And electronic technology generally does this. It retrieves the phenomenon of bodiless voices, bodiless images and eidolons, phantoms and ghosts in the form of these pixelated images, or when you're on a cell phone, you're talking to a disembodied voice. It retrieves the astral plane in a mechanized way, in a technological way. So in that sense, it does bring back the dream world, and it creates this parallel universe in which we all want to copy and create a sort of dream avatar. Each one of us, we feel nowadays, we've defined these parameters in such a way that you don't feel like you're anybody unless you're in cyberspace, unless you have videos up on YouTube or a Facebook account. So the idea is that we all incarnate nowadays into this parallel self-luminous dimension, and you have to have an avatar there if you want to be anybody. And of course the pioneers for this were celebrities. Celebrities were the first to do this. They were the first to descend into the electronic plasma pool, replicate copies of themselves as technologized equivalents of the astral and the subtle bodies, and to suffer the death and resurrection that they went through in the phenomenon of dealing with their mediatized avatars, which in the case of a number of them, was very tragic. Marilyn Monroe, for example, is a tragic case where she generated this parallel avatar through the medium of film, and it competed with her for attention, and pretty soon people were only interested in that avatar and not in her. They didn't want to hear Marilyn Monroe talk anything about her favorite books, which were Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. They didn't. The real Marilyn was completely was a three-dimensional phenomenon, completely out of accord with the two-dimensional flat iconic avatar, the sort of stained glass icon that she had created of herself as the dumb ditzy blonde, a sort of modern incarnation of Venus, the urban Venus, the megalopolis Venus. And people were only interested in that, and it became the tragic agon of her life, and she ended up dying as a result of this struggle to get, this competition with her own avatar.